Well, welcome to another installment of Joe and Josh Discuss. We're grateful that you've joined us again. Today, we'll be in Genesis chapter 45, beginning in verse 16. And we're picking up the story sort of in the middle of a story. Joseph has revealed himself to his brothers, and they are taking it all in. They talked with him, it says afterwards, but we're not told what they talked about. I know, Joe, you have some speculation about that. And then the report is coming to Pharaoh, and that's really where we pick up the story. Pharaoh's going to hear about all this, and Joseph has already, extended the invitation for his family to come to live with him in Egypt, but he's not asked Pharaoh yet.
Well, it doesn't say reveal it in the text, but now that you mention it, it sounds like maybe he was doing greasing the wheels. Should we say before so? But or maybe he was laughing with Pharaoh, telling him, "Hey, my family's coming here, and I'm pulling a trick on them." I don't know, but it is interesting that Pharaoh's house hears all this stuff happening, and I think the text before was revealing that it was the crying and the weeping and the groans that Joseph had that really stirred the curiosity of Pharaoh and all the people in the court. So
we don't know that much about ancient Egyptian culture, but apparently there's one thing that was the same then as is now, and that is the rumor weed.
Yes, the gossiping.
Right? The word on the street was,
right.
Joseph has made a big deal out of this group, and apparently they are his relatives.
And the whole house heard.
I wonder if that's a shock, because Joseph had come to Egypt as a slave of the Midianites.
Mm.
I wonder if folks assumed at that time that he maybe didn't have a family or something had gone wrong, especially such a large family.
Mm.
That must have begged some further questions.
Yeah, they were definitely trying to figure that one out.
You know, in some parts of the world today, parents have been known to sell their children into slavery for various reasons.
Yeah.
So I wonder if that happened in the ancient world and they didn't think much of it. I really don't know. But you'd think it must be quite a surprise to people who knew Joseph for a number of years and saw how he got to this position to find out that he had this enormous family.
Right. Yeah. And then the beginning of the idea of what does this mean? I mean, I'm sure if you're the leader of a nation and you're thinking, hey, all these people are going to come in, so how's that going to benefit our nation?
Yeah, you'd think it'd be a surprise if you've raised someone to a position of leadership and you say to them, hey, I'm really appreciative for everything you're doing a great job. You know, anything you need, you ask me. And then he says, well, I've got 72 people I need to house. That's a big, oh, 72, you say? Or is
Yeah.
it 70? We don't know. It depends on if you're reading Greek or Hebrew.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is going to be a big request that he's going to make of Pharaoh.
Right. And the same token, you have to think about that there must have been some discussions. They had to have been.
Well, we'll read it, I suppose, and see how it develops. But I agree with you. I think there's a lot that goes unsaid here. Well, let's read it. It makes it seem like it goes pretty well.
Yeah, it does. It does. It might have been some awkwardness about it, I'm sure.
Yeah, there's a lot. Again, we keep saying this, and it's good to just reiterate that it's a compressed history. It's a selective history. We're not told everything that happened, but the prophetic tradition of Israel, beginning with Moses, has preserved this story with the details that we need to know to understand it by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. But it doesn't say everything that happened. It couldn't. I mean, that would be a book beyond binding, right? The publisher would have said, I'm sorry, that's too much text. We can't do that. I think the Bible has done, obviously it was inspired by God. What an enormous amount of history covered in such an economy of language and still revealing the truth of everything that happened. It's really quite a marvel. And so sometimes we'd like to know more than we know, but it is amazing how perfectly written it is.
Yeah, it's enough to keep you teased. Some of the stuff that you're like, well, I wonder what that's about.
Yeah. Well, do you want to read this for us? How far should we go? Genesis chapter 45, we're beginning in verse 16. So maybe through 24.
Okay, we can do that. When the report was heard in Pharaoh's house Joseph's brothers have come. Pharaoh and his servants were pleased. Pharaoh said to Joseph, say to your brothers, do this, load your animals and go back to the land of Canaan. Take your father and your households and come to me, so I may give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you may enjoy the fat of the land. You are further charged to say, do this, take wagons from the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father and come. Give no thought to your possessions, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. The sons of Israel did so. Joseph gave them wagons according to the instruction of Pharaoh, and he gave them provisions for the journey. To each of them he gave a set of garments. But to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 sets of garments. To his father he sent the following: 10 donkeys loaded with the good things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and provision for his father on the journey. Then he sent his brothers on the way. As they were leaving, he said to them, do not quarrel along the way.
So we made a big deal there at the beginning that this would be a quite large request that Joseph was making of Pharaoh, but boy, he took it well, didn't he?
Yes, he did. He did. And he seems to be really concerned about making sure that Joseph and his family, it seems so good. You almost feel like, where's the hitch? Is there something else here? What's he thinking? But the other part of me is like, well, he's thankful because they're 2 years in and they have 5 more years of famine coming.
This must speak to how much Joseph was revered in Egypt, don't you think?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, he must have had such respect by this point to receive this kind of a welcome from Pharaoh. I think this is gratuitous.
Yeah. Well, there's also so much surplus. I mean, you think you're 2 years in, there must be like, how long is this? Are we going to have enough stuff? We bring in more people. This idea of immigration.
You're right. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking of Daniel too. Daniel gets this kind of reception with Babylon, and then later even with the Medes and the Persians when they conquer Babylon. And at one point, the other leaders are so jealous of Daniel that they hunt high and low to find some reason of accusation against him. And they find that he has been a loyal citizen, that they can't find anything that would amount to some sort of transgression they could get rid of him for. And you get a sense, don't you, that Joseph has that kind of reputation in Egypt at this point, even though he went to prison because he was accused of trying to sleep with Potiphar's wife, which we know was a false charge. By this point, he seems to be highly regarded, and I think that speaks to his character, don't you?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, the realization, what Pharaoh says, it's like you'd almost feel like he's just really thought this through. But it feels like he's saying, don't worry about nothing. It is kind of amazing. I mean, there's this idea too, if you flash back to what Joseph said, what you meant for evil, God has made for good here. That idea, or don't be upset with yourself, that he says to his brothers. There seems like there's more going on here than just Pharaoh being generous.
What do you think more is going on?
Well, Pharaoh definitely wouldn't admit it, but we would say that maybe God is making him generous.
I wondered if that's what you were getting at, that this, here I was interested in maybe just taking it very flatly and thinking, boy, Joseph must have really earned Pharaoh's favor. But you get a sense that maybe God's softening his heart.
Pharaoh's heart, yeah, definitely.
And this is what Jacob prayed for, right? When he sent his sons, that God would show mercy, that the man would show mercy, the man. Remember, we've assumed the man is Joseph.
Right.
And Joseph does show mercy, right? His bowels are stirred up exactly as Jacob prayed. We talked about that last time or 2 times ago. I can't remember. But Pharaoh also shows mercy.
Hmm.
So I think you're right. I think we are meant to see Pharaoh's response as being motivated by another answer to Jacob's prayer, that God's at work beneath that. I think that's a good observation. I mean, I'm not saying that I think Joseph did not distinguish himself. I think he has.
Yeah.
But I agree. I think this is very unexpected. I would have expected a leader of Pharaoh's stature to have hesitated with a family this large coming in as immigrants and then becoming permanent residents of his land. I think
Yeah.
that's excessive.
And especially when you compare that to the idea that they couldn't even eat together. Shepherds were just despised or detestable to the Egyptians. I think that when you put it up against that backdrop, you see that there's something else that has to be going on here, because to say I'll give them the best land in Egypt and enjoy the fat of the land. I remember reading a little bit of part about that where it was saying like the best land of Egypt is the most fertile. And although they are in famine and the land doesn't really matter right at the moment, but I
Yeah.
think they're talking about hospitality, that kind of thing, and then the idea of the fat of the land. That's the excess. I thought about it for a moment. It's like our bodies, they store when you eat food in times of desperation, your body stores it in the fat, and then your body is able to use that. So I was thinking about what that really meant. Enjoy the fat of the land. That's the energy, the stored energy, the food, the excess of the land at the moment. He's offering that to them, the best of it, which is beyond generous.
Yeah. And the word is an interesting word. I don't know if we want to get into it too much, but the word is halev. That's the fat here. And it's used of the human body often in terms of the belly fat,
Mm-hmm.
fat around the intestines. And when it's used of animals, it's again that midriff fat, sometimes associated with the heart as well. So it's kind of like you're saying, the extra.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's another word for fat, meaning heavy, often translated glorious, which has
Mm-hmm.
to do with the strength
Mm-hmm.
of the land. That's not what he offers him. He offers him the excess.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know in what way Goshen is excess.
Right.
Like maybe it's very fertile land that's not being used. Maybe it's uninhabited.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's what he means. And I tend that way as to that's what he's saying. But they have a perfect area for them to live given their lifestyle. And it also creates some separation between them and the Egyptians, which is appealing to the Egyptians. So I think Joseph's just like, there's a perfect little extra place.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think what he means by the fat of the land is the best of the land. I don't think that's what he means. I would have expected a different Hebrew description for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you would think that he would be holding back the best of the land for himself, Pharaoh's, or his house. And I think it's trying to make that stark comparison to what Joseph's past was like. I think that's what's really being brought out, and almost to the fact where like, here, I'm empowering you to bless your family. But to say Egypt is yours is quite a statement.
It really is. And I don't know, my sense is that this is a very gracious welcome, but I still think some of this is formality. I mean, it's a very gracious welcome. I think God is definitely healing Pharaoh's heart from any prejudices that might exist and other things that we've been led to believe to this point might skew the response. He's obviously let all that go. He's gracious in his response. I think by fat of the land, he means I have a perfect extra place that's not currently taken for you. And then when he says, the land is yours, I
Mhm.
think that's a little overstatement, But I think that's kind of the welcome you would give to a well-received dignitary, like the key to the city. That's my sense anyway.
It's definitely above board, though.
So just to jump into a little bit of, I don't know if this is interesting to anybody else, but there's been a lot of changes in Egyptian history right around the time from Joseph to when Moses is eventually sent to deliver the people from slavery in Egypt. And it's hard to actually know where we are because what the Bible says and what critical scholars say are not exactly the same. So I should at least say the critical date of the Exodus out of Egypt under Moses, the critical date, meaning critical scholars have hypothesized that that's around 1290 BC. And if you accept that date, what I'm about to say would be very different. But according to the Bible's dates, and this is the way you calculate the Bible's dates is not straightforward. It's not as though you can find one verse that tells you exactly the date of the Exodus, but we do have the date of the dedication of the temple by Solomon. And then we can work our way back to the reigns of Saul and of David. And then there's other clues and other passages in the Old Testament about the length of the period of the judges and whatnot. And if you add all that together, you get 1446 BC as the biblical date of the Exodus. Then you have to work back from that to Joseph. I go into all that just to initiate this next conversation, which is how quickly a blessing can turn into a curse. Now, curses can turn into blessings. We've already seen that in the story of Joseph. We talked about that a great deal in our last two episodes. The way in which what his brothers intended for evil was turned to their good. But from the larger perspective, even though coming here to live in Egypt, as Joseph invites his family to do and Pharaoh welcomes them, is going to save them from the famine, it is also the first step to 450 years of slavery and hard bondage to the Egyptians. This is a blessing in that it saves them, but it is also a curse. And if we put it in context, Abraham in chapter 15 of Genesis, which we discussed years ago now, was already told it was going to happen. And God told Abraham why it was going to happen. He said, because the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So God delivers Israel out of the land and into the hand of the Egyptians in part to provide 400 years of mercy to the inhabitants of the land of Canaan before he finally brings judgment on them through the Israelites. So it's a very complicated story God is telling. And Israel is sometimes on the beneficial side of it. But in this gracious response of Pharaoh, they're also very near to the curse side of it. This blessing will turn into a curse. But a blessing to the Amorites, a curse to the Israelites. I mean, this is such a complicated tale, right? How do you, I don't know if you even want to talk about all that, but I thought it was worth pursuing.
Yeah, well, there's the issue too of constant being weighed and tested. We see that a lot in the story between Joseph and his brothers, but even the baggage of the past of Jacob's family, going all the way back to when he was with Laban, this shady stuff, some of the stuff, there's always that stuff that has to be tested to see whether or not you are seeking God or you are willing to walk with God. And you see those constant opportunities for testing.
And I wanted to pause and really think about it because this is a huge test. You remember, we've been talking about Genesis now with a pause, but for 3 years. And the largest movement of Genesis is the movement of Abraham out of Ur into the land of promise, into the land of Canaan. And God makes exorbitant promises to Abraham, right? That his children will be as numerous as the sand on the seashore, as the stars in the sky, promises him that he and his wife have been barren their whole married lives and now are in their 90s, well, 70s at first, and then they don't give birth till 90s. He tells them they're going to have a son of their own body, which is, as we all know, quite impossible after a woman has passed through menopause and has been through it for many years. So we have all those promises. We have when Abraham separates from Lot, God has him walk up to the hill country and he shows him all the lands. This is all going to be yours. All that's coming apart right here in this story, right? Because now they're leaving.
Mm.
They're going to become residents of
Mhm.
Egypt.
Mhm.
Now, you might say, well, I think Jacob probably thought that was just for the duration of the famine. But they end up staying there for 450 years, and that was prophesied to Abraham. I don't know how much he shared with Isaac and how much Isaac shared with Jacob. If that was part of the birthright and blessing they received was also the story, which I think it might have been.
Mhm.
So maybe they knew, but can you imagine? Let's just hypothesize that Jacob, when he receives this news, he's going to shortly. He's overjoyed, of course. Joseph will get into all that. He agrees to go. God is actually going to visit Jacob, a rare occurrence in Jacob's life,
Mhm.
to encourage him to do this thing. But does he also know that in moving his family, he's moving them into 400 years of slavery? If he knows the story of Abraham, he knows that because
Mhm.
God told Abraham that.
Right.
Talk about a feeling of, here we
Yeah.
go. We're not going to be back here in my lifetime. We're not going to be back here in my kid's lifetime. We're not going to be back here in my grandkids' lifetime, or my great grandkids' lifetime, or my great great grandkids' lifetime. We're going to be more years in Egypt than there have been from Abraham's leaving of Ur till now.
Wow.
I mean, this is a bittersweet moment, I would imagine. I think sometimes because we know the whole history, we forget what all this means. We're inclined to think, oh, what a gracious response. It's so nice of Pharaoh. What a gift Joseph is giving them. What a great salvation of God. And then we have to remember what happens next.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes the blessing turns into curse. And in this case, Israel will be asked to suffer for 450 years so God can show mercy to the inhabitants of Canaan before he displaces them.
Mhm.
And that's 400 years of suffering so God can show mercy to somebody else. And Jacob, I really believe this. I know it's unstated in the text, but we do have these stories today. And we have them because the family of Abraham kept those stories alive. And
Mhm.
Jacob is part of that chain. So the knowledge of the promise God made to Abraham and the prophecy of the slavery in Egypt, we have to assume Jacob received that. Otherwise, how would we have it?
Mhm. Right.
And if he knew that, there's a huge elephant in the room here that we should not ignore when he receives the word that Joseph's alive and that in order to survive, they have to go to Egypt. I just imagine Jacob was like, oh, it's starting now. In
Yeah.
my lifetime, it's starting. I'm going to be the patriarch that brings them there. Like, I don't know if he knew that.
Yeah. Well, if it was, it was blinded by Joseph's alive.
I just want to prepare us for the reception of Jacob because I think we're going to see both exuberance and resistance in him. And I think it's because of all the people in this story, Jacob knows
You know.
what this means.
Mhm.
You know, of course, he wants to go see Joseph, but when he leaves Canaan, he knows he's not coming back.
Mhm.
He knows this story. I mean, Abraham went to Egypt and came back.
Mhm.
Isaac went to Egypt and came back. But there's a sense that I see in Jacob's response that he knows he's not coming back.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. Well, he makes Joseph make a promise to him. We know that, but this phrase "do not quarrel along the way." Do you want to talk about that?
What do you think Joseph means by that?
Well, I mean, they've gotten the best deal ever. I think he's. I mean, there's a little footnote there. It says, don't be agitated along the way." In other words, don't do anything stupid, fellers. you know, or blow this deal. You blow this deal, it's going to be bad. You know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's somewhat poorly translated in the text. And if you have a New Revised Standard Version like we do, you'll see that there's a footnote that says it could be translated be agitated.
Hmm.
And I think that's more likely. There is a stem in Hebrew where if this was in the Hifil stem, I know that doesn't mean anything, but if it were, it could be used in the sense of provoking somebody to wrath. So that
Mm.
might be the sense of quarrel, but it's not in the Hifil stem. It's in the Kal stem, which is a different stem. And in that stem, it usually means to be agitated, to quiver, to be nervous, to be anxious. And I really think, and I think the footnote of the New Revised Standard Version indicates they know it too.
Mm.
Choral is probably traditional and it's hard to change traditional words because people get upset. But I
Hmm.
think this is probably Joseph saying, please try not to be nervous on your way back.
Mm.
This isn't a bad thing.
Now everybody's going, right? Simeon's going,
Yeah.
Benjamin's going.
Yeah.
Do you think there's he should have kept Benjamin behind? I mean, I had to read closely to make sure that wasn't the case.
But I think what he's saying to them is, I'm not going to mess with you anymore.
Mm.
The last time they went, they ended up with silver in their sacks. They found out things. His servant tracked him down and said, you have the cup of divination. Every
Mm.
time they've left Egypt, something bad has happened.
Hmm.
I think he's saying, don't worry on this trip. It's going to go well. I'm done. I'm done.
Yeah. It sounds like another test, though. A little bit of a test. Like by him saying that, he's still saying, "I'm in charge." Don't quarrel on the way, guys, because I'm going to find out. And
Yeah,
and don't you ever think of not coming back.
it could be like if you translate it quarrel, I can see how you would read it that way. I don't think this should be translated quarrel. I'm with the footnote for the New Revised Standard Version. Don't be
Yeah.
agitated. I think that's it. And so it is a power thing. I think Joseph is clearly saying, I could stop you again, like I did the last time, but don't worry, I won't.
Mm. It's obvious now that the dream came true.
Yeah. So you had mentioned before we started recording the issue of these 300 pieces of silver that he gives to Benjamin and 5 sets of garments.
Mm.
And we did a little research. We did not remember this. Let's be clear. We weren't sure
Mm.
that we were told how many pieces of silver Joseph was sold for, right? We
Right.
weren't sure. I didn't remember the number at all, and you thought maybe there was the number, but you didn't remember. So we looked it up, and sure enough, in Genesis 37:28, we are told that Joseph was sold to the Midianites for 20 pieces of silver.
Hmm.
And it's interesting that when he sends them all back, he sends a gratuitous amount of wealth with Benjamin, and it's exactly 15 times what he was sold for.
Hmm.
And there's something about this 5
Hmm.
for Joseph, right? He gives Benjamin 5 times the amount of food. He gives him 3 times 5 the amount of silver he was sold for. And then he gives him 5 sets of garments. I don't
Right.
know what the significance of that 5 was for Joseph, but boy, it seems too recurrent to be a coincidence.
Right. Yeah. To me, it sounds random, but there's that number is easily calculated. Benjamin probably had a beefy donkey.
Yeah, yeah. Or
It
maybe 5 of these are his.
could be 5 to 10. Well, there's 20 of them actually. 20 donkeys.
I don't know why the number 5. It could be random, like you said. It could be a symbolic number of some sort for Joseph, or it may be somehow connected to how Joseph calculates the birthright and blessing. It's hard to say where the number comes from, but he's definitely using multiples of 5 deliberately. And that's not a number, as I think about it, that I see coming into the history of Israel that often. You think of other numbers as more significant, like 7s and 12s, and the number 40, the number 70. Those numbers all become very significant throughout the Hebrew Bible, but I can't think of 5s being that significant, but they are here for Joseph.
Hmm. Maybe it was an Egyptian thing.
Could be. That's what we don't know. Again, we're
Mhm.
always baffled by what we're not told.
Right. Keeps us guessing, right? Although the major thing is that it's more than the other brothers got, for sure. They're not going away empty-handed. That's for
No,
sure.
they're not. Yeah, they're going back with everything they brought plus a whole lot of extra. And then he's sending them also with an invitation to come and live out the famine in Egypt where there's food.
Right. Right.
Let's look at Jacob's response here.
Sure. Yeah.
So this is verse 25. I'll read this one. So it says, so they went up out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. And they told him, Joseph is still alive. He is even ruler over all the land of Egypt. He was stunned. He could not believe them. But when they told him all the words of Joseph that he had said to them, and when he saw the wagons that Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. Israel said, enough. My son Joseph is still alive. I must go and see him before I die.
Mm.
And then 46 verse 1, when Israel set out on his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, here I am. Then he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's own hand shall close your eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Then Jacob set out from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob, their little ones and their wives, in the wagons that Pharaoh had sent to carry him. They also took their livestock and the goods that they had acquired in the land of Canaan, and they came into Egypt, Jacob and all his offspring with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, all his offspring he brought with him into Egypt. And then we have a listing of everyone who came in with him. And then we get down to verse 26. All the persons belonging to Jacob who came into Egypt, who were his own offspring, not including the wives of his sons, were 66 persons in all. The children of Joseph who were born to in Egypt were 2. All the persons of the house of Jacob who came into Egypt were 70.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've said this before. I'm pretty sure the Greek Septuagint translation of this says 72.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout the various First Testament and New Testament writings, you'll see those numbers go back and forth between 70 and 72, depending on the reference. But we're in the ballpark here.
Right.
And maybe we should just say this, which is verse 28. Israel sent Judah ahead to Joseph to lead the way before him into Goshen. That's interesting, right?
Yeah.
When they came to the land of Goshen, Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to meet his father Israel. In Goshen, he presented himself to him, fell on his neck, and wept on his neck a good while. Israel said to Joseph, I can die now, having seen for myself that you are still alive. So, how do you want to start this with Jacob's response?
He still got disbelief. I mean, that this idea that even though he's been told the man, now they don't know that he doesn't know until this point. Verse 25 that Joseph's alive. He's
Right.
I think the word stunned and he couldn't believe them is putting it lightly. Are there some, your wordsmith, are there some other words that you would throw in there other than stunned, or maybe if you had the amplified version of the Bible, what would they have there in
So
play?
the word that's being translated is the word hug.
Yeah, oog.
Hug. And it means to grow numb or to become very cold or to feel helpless. In some contexts, it can be used to feel crushed and incapable of moving or responding. So I can see why they translated it stunned. That's pretty good, right?
So
But we could think of some other words.
are you getting the visual? Is Jaws like on the ground? Is that what it's like? Or
Yeah, yeah, just in total shock. is what I might say, like unresponsive. Jacob appeared to everybody as catatonic for a period of time.
Right. Yeah.
And he couldn't believe them.
Couldn't believe him.
So what they actually say to him is Yosef Chai, which means Joseph lives.
Mm. Even the ruler over the land of Egypt. That's even more of a jaw dropper. I mean, you can be proud of your son, but it's like, what do you mean he's in charge too? He was dead. You told me he was dead.
Yeah.
I can hear him now. Like, what are you, crazy?
But then they explained to him everything Joseph had said. And I wonder if part of that was the story of how this all occurred.
Or was it what you meant for good for evil? God is used for good. You think that was in that conversation, or do you think?
Sure. And remember, he specifically said, "Tell my father that I am a father to Pharaoh." That's the fulfillment of the dream,
Mm,
right? So Jacob hears all this, and then his spirit revived, which is the same word really in a different form. Joseph lives, Chai. This is from Chaya.
mm,
So at the knowledge that Joseph is alive, Jacob became more alive.
mm.
So revived is a good word, but he was filled with this life.
Yeah, I feel like it's the other side of the coin, like stunned and then revived. Like, I feel like once he heard his son was dead, even way back when he showed him the jacket, like if you were draining the blood out of him, he was just losing,
Yeah.
losing, losing, losing. Simeon, and then now Benjamin, and then now
Yeah.
he's back on the roller coaster ride with it.
Yeah. And then you got to love his response. And
Yeah,
now he's called Israel again.
yeah.
And I don't love this translation. So Israel said, enough. Now, when I read that as a 21st century English speaking American, if I said to somebody enough, I would mean, all right, quiet down. I don't want to listen to anyone.
Mhm.
Right? Enough. But this word is the word Rav, which means much or full or many or
Mhm.
great. So I think you remember what he said before when he sent his sons. He said, I am bereaved, I am bereaved.
Mhm.
But now he says, he just exclaims, full, like enough, meaning I have a lot,
Mhm.
like not enough, like stop talking, like enough, like full, I have much. He just says, much,
Yeah.
great, full. Joseph is alive, right? His tank is just like filled right up. He went from feeling empty to feeling full. That's what he's saying.
from
And then
from
he
the
says, I have to go and see him
yeah
before I die.
from the garden hose to the fire hose.
Right. Yeah. Or from the empty bucket, he's got his little canteen and it's empty and he's wringing it out trying to get water. And the next thing you know, he's hitting the face with a fire hose. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'm full. And he doesn't even hesitate.
Mm,
I'm going. And I've already said, this is why I wanted to say that. Jacob knows what going means,
yeah.
but he's so anxious to see Joseph. All those implications he puts aside.
Hmm.
So he sets out on his journey with everything that he has, and they must be living a little further north, maybe in the hill country around Bethel.
Hmm.
And he comes south to Beersheba, which is where Isaac spent almost all of his life. So it's not surprising that when he arrives there, he offers sacrifices to the God of Isaac. Isaac is the one who dug the well here.
Hmm.
He's the one who made the treaty with Abimelech, if we remember the story, that gave him this town as his first permanent inhabitants in the land. So Beersheba belongs to Isaac and to Jacob, but Jacob apparently didn't live there.
Hmm.
But when he came down to it, this is where he makes a sacrifice to God. And you wonder why.
Hmm.
Is he thanking God, or is he inquiring of the Lord?
Hmm.
Or is he trying to put forward his intention of returning? It's difficult to know why at this moment. This is not a common occurrence for Jacob.
Hmm.
He did this last, I think in the story, I think I'm right about this, when he first returned back from his time with Laban. I think he does this. But now he's leaving.
Hmm.
And so he makes this sacrifice. I think he's seeking the Lord. I think that's why you make a sacrifice in these days. I think he's inquiring of the Lord.
Hmm.
And I think it's because he's so anxious to go see Joseph, he's going. But I think he knows the implications of this. I think that's why he makes it, but we're not really told. But I think we can discern some of what he was hoping for in God's response.
Right. Yeah. It is quite comforting if you know you're going to go into or send your whole family into slavery for 450 years. It is quite comforting to know that God promises he'll be with you. Just want to make sure it's the right God. I mean, it does say the God of your father, but maybe there's this idea that coming home or to where Isaac spent most of his life, that would be kind of a good, could I use the graphic idea of a good switchboard or a good place to make a connection with God to validate this movement.
Isaac primarily lived in Beersheba, so it's pretty much where Jacob was raised. It's like going home for him. And he
Mm-hmm.
probably associates it a great deal with those early days with God and the teachings about God. And it's probably in Beersheba where he heard the story of their future slavery in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Well, not only the idea of the sacrifice to God, if he thought for any moment that anything he had done, the way he treated his family, the way he treated his wives, any shadiness aspect of it, could this be a last ditch effort to make sure that he's right before God before he makes a major move?
Yeah.
That could be
Yeah.
something.
I think he's entreating the Lord for maybe all of those reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Because he first leaves home to go to Haran to find a wife, as his father had done. And he ends up a slave to Laban for 14 years.
Mm-hmm.
After he finally gets out of that, he returns home, has a much better reception at home than he thought. His brother doesn't try to kill him. Praise the Lord. Makes a home for himself. And now he's leaving again to lead his family into slavery. So Jacob's life, at least his walk with God apart from his father, begins as a slave and ends as a slave. And freedom is a very short period of time in the middle for him. It's an interesting historical arc, don't you think? Not typically what you would expect of a patriarch.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, Jacob was deceptive, and I'm not saying that he didn't make his own bed in some ways,
Mm-hmm.
the way he cheated his brother and all of that. But it's interesting how his story ends up going.
Mm-hmm.
But he's receiving this as blessing. Joseph is alive. He entreats the Lord, and the Lord actually speaks to him.
Mm-hmm.
This is not very common in his life. The Lord speaks to him, don't get me wrong. And we're even told after the fact a few communications from God we didn't know about at the time, like when it came to the breeding of the animals. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not as though Jacob's whole life has been silence, but
Mm-hmm.
he doesn't get visited as much as Abraham.
Yeah.
But
Right.
here's a significant one. And God assures him that he will not abandon him in Egypt. And this is a word. I would imagine that Jacob's children, for the next 450 plus years, went back to this promise and remembered it.
Right.
It's a very significant promise.
It seems as though this is kind of the format mainly though where God gets Jacob's attention. It doesn't it says calls him out by name. It's not like is this you? Are you talking to me kind of thing. It's pretty bold and right at it and specific. I
And
don't
God changed Jacob's name already
hmm
to Israel, but when he addresses him here, he calls him by his given name, Jacob. Is
hmm
that significant?
Yeah, it does, because it seems like the name Israel, when he calls him Israel, it says God spoke to Israel in a vision. That's what it says in verse 2. And then it says Jacob, Jacob. It's almost like Israel is like his purpose name, and Jacob is like who his personal name is. I don't know if I can make that distinction. It's just something that came to me. Where it kind of foreshadows what that nation or that family is going to experience. They're going to struggle to be a nation, to be a people, to connect in good and difficult times. Um, and
Yeah,
so,
and Jacob, that name means he who grasps the heel, right? And it euphemistically has come to mean deceiver.
mhm,
And Israel means God fighter,
right,
the
right,
one who wrestles with God and overcomes.
right,
So if God is addressing him in such a way as to say, we're going to have our battles, you'd think he would choose the name Israel.
mhm, mhm,
But he chooses the name Jacob. So try this on for size. I've been insisting, even though I know it feels beneath the text and not explicitly stated,
mhm,
I feel this is a big and critical moment for Jacob because I think he knows what going to Egypt means for him.
mhm,
And so there is, I think, a conflicted spirit. He wants to see Joseph for sure,
mhm.
but he also, I think, knows what this means. It means he's going to die in Egypt.
Yeah.
And Israel is going to be in Egypt for a long time. So I think the Lord speaks very softly to him with his given name, Jacob. Jacob. He says it twice.
Mhm,
And Jacob says what all of those confronted by God have said throughout history, both before and after: Hineni,
mhm,
here I am,
mhm,
great Hebrew phrase. And then he says, I am the God, literally. There's a definite article there. I am the Elohim, the
mhm.
God of your father. Don't be afraid to go down to Egypt. And you might be asking yourself, well, we don't see him being afraid. He's anxious, right? He wants to see Joseph. And that's where I'm saying this is the subtext. There's reason for him to be afraid.
Right, right.
And God is saying, don't be afraid. I'll make you a great nation there. I'll go with you and I'll bring you out again.
Mhm,
And Joseph's own hand shall close your eyes. You'll die there,
right.
which means I'll bring your bones out.
Mhm. I'll bring your bones out.
That's an intimate conversation, I think, between God and Jacob. And I suspect that's why he calls him Jacob.
Mhm,
This is the young boy who was named Jacob because he grasped the heel of his brother
mhm,
when they were being born,
mhm,
right? And so there's something personal there. It reminds me a little bit of what Jesus does with Peter. So Peter's given name was Simon.
mhm. Yeah.
Jesus changes his name to Peter, which
Mhm,
means stone, which we know in Aramaic was Cephas,
mhm,
and then translated into Peter when the Bible's written in Greek. But at the end of his life, when Peter has betrayed him by denying him 3 times, and Jesus is talking to him about his love for him, and he says, do you love me? I think I'm right about this. I think he says, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?
mhm,
Back to his given name.
mhm. Where is the prohibition? Do you recall? I recall. I just don't know where it is. Where they weren't to go back to Egypt. Did God say that to Abraham? Do not go back to Egypt.
He says it, I think, to the Israelites after they're delivered from slavery.
Oh, okay.
They're never to return to Egypt, which is an interesting, what does that mean? Especially since you remember when Jesus is born, Joseph and Mary actually go to Egypt to
Right.
hide from Herod.
Yeah. But it was the Gospels say that was to fulfill the scripture where it says, "I called my son out of Egypt." So
That was a recapitulation of the Exodus story of the going to Egypt as slaves and returning.
yeah, even Joseph bringing my son out.
Exactly. It's Joseph bringing Jesus, and it's Joseph in this text bringing the children of Israel to Egypt. It's amazing
Mhm,
how the very name of Jesus' father is significant,
mhm, mhm.
because the same Joseph is the one who brings the sons of Israel to Egypt, and Joseph is the one who brought the Son of God to Egypt.
Yeah, there is something about being said that I'm going to go down there with you, and I'm going to make a great nation out of you. I don't think Jacob really sees himself as a nation. I think he sees himself more as a clan, or maybe extended family, but I don't think he sees himself necessarily as a nation. So that might be also something that's really draws out some feeling within Jacob about this idea. Well, God's going to go with me, or he says he's going to go with me, but he's going to make a great nation out of us. What's that mean?
Well, we've heard that language before. Do you remember when?
Well, with Abraham, you're saying.
Abraham. So this is a renewal of the covenant made with Abraham that's now been ratified with Jacob. What I'm recalling is that when God first called Abraham to leave Ur in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, his specific language to him in verse 2 was, I will make of you a great nation. It's this
Mm-hmm,
exact language.
mm-hmm,
So he's repeating what he said to Abraham to Jacob.
mm-hmm.
But he did not tell Abraham he would do that in Egypt.
Right. Yeah, that's what's
He's
surprising, I
telling
think.
Jacob that that promise will be fulfilled not in Canaan, but in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an interest that's new information, but it's still a repeating of the promise to Abraham.
Yeah, but it says I will go down there, and verse 4 I think is instrumental too. I will go down there with you to Egypt, and I will bring you up again. I think that's maybe just a little broader than just Jacob himself. His being. I think that I get the feeling that you is plural.
Yeah, well, it ends up being plural because it's all of Israel.
Yeah, right.
But in some ways, it is interesting to read it that way, as God means this corporately.
Hmm.
You would expect God to have called him Israel.
Right.
But
Yeah.
when he calls him Jacob, there is a very personal element to this.
Hmm.
And of course, Jacob represents the nation,
Hmm.
but it's a very personal promise. I think,
Hmm.
and the you is singular.
Hmm.
He's in Hebrew, he's saying it to Jacob and he calls him Jacob. Jacob, I will bring you back. Now, of course, Jacob can't come back unless all of his family comes back in a way.
Hmm.
But this is fulfilled very literally, right? Because when Jacob dies, Joseph does not wait to bring his bones back when all of Israel comes out of Egypt the way Joseph's bones are brought back. He
Hmm.
actually makes a special trip, right, to the Holy Land and buries Jacob here, Jacob personally, before the years of slavery start. And there is a promise there of God to Jacob personally that he'll be buried in this land.
That's good. Good. Good
But it
insight.
is also corporate. I mean, of course, he's also going to bring his children back.
Yeah.
But
Well,
they're going to be Jacob's return and the children's return is going to be separated by quite a number of centuries.
right. Well, Joseph closing his eyes to is an intimate, finalizing way of saying for his to see his son and be closured with him.
Right? Isn't it a promise of God that he won't die on the journey, that he'll
Right.
make sure he sees Joseph?
Yeah. So he's reassuring him quite a bit. You
Yeah,
know.
because he had said before, I better go see him before I die. We could say, well, that's maybe hyperbole, but it's also possible that Jacob is very near to death and he's not even sure he can make the journey, which might explain why he didn't take the journey himself to Egypt.
Yeah.
It may be a big health issue for him. He may be very near death. And one of the things he may be afraid of, even in starting out on this journey, is that he won't even get to see Joseph before he completes it. It's going to be a long journey and probably not easy for someone his age. So God concludes with the promise that he'll make it.
Hmm.
You'll
Yeah.
make it to Egypt to see him,
Yeah. That's
which is
good
a
stuff.
great promise.
Right. Yeah. It's something to cling on to, and and as you said before, I think it was insightful too, is that this is something that generations will cling to. they probably said this like a catechism. I am the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. I will make you a great nation. I could see them saying this.
Couldn't you imagine them saying it over and over again as the slavery got worse and worse over the centuries, and as it reached its peak just in the lifetime of Moses, just before God delivered? Could you just see them
Mhm,
claiming this promise at the dinner table,
mhm,
singing it as a praise song in great hope, as so many who have been enslaved have sung? I'm reading this book right now called The Cross and the Lynching Tree.
mhm,
And it is an amazing, not amazing in any kind of a good way. It's an eye-opening, heart-wrenching story of Christian faith from the perspective of the African American people
mhm,
in the years following their freedom from slavery, but before they really received rights as American citizens that would have been in any way equal to the rights of those of European descent.
mhm,
And listening to that story and the way in which they sung the songs when they lived under the threat every day of being killed, of being lynched for looking at someone the wrong way, and lynching, just the horror and how much like Jesus' crucifixion lynching was, the torture, the public humiliation, the fact that it was done without a trial, as a type of mob justice, as a way of keeping them down and feeling powerless, that they didn't know if they would, in any meal sitting in their house, if they wouldn't be dragged out, and that would be their last day on earth. Like, just reading that from the perspective of that kind of life, I can't even believe. Like, it's upending to me.
mhm.
Maybe no people in modern history know quite the experience of Jesus like that community did, because of what they experienced. But I'm thinking that's the experience really of the Israelites in
Mhm.
Egypt, especially as it gets worse and worse. In the last 100 years seems to be the worst of the worst of the worst for them. And they had the same experience. These Egyptian soldiers, by the end of this time, will just walk into their house and drag out their sons and kill those babies right in front of them. You imagine living like that. And I just imagine this promise must have, when God says to Moses, I've heard the cries of my people.
Mhm.
I am certain some of those cries were this verse.
Mhm.
Fulfill your promise.
Mhm.
How long, O Lord, how long before you fulfill this promise? You can hear it echoing through the ages. And sadly enough, history's repeated itself. And populations of people through history have found themselves in the same place as Israel, and I'm sure crying out to the same God, some of them
Mhm.
begging for help. And so I think this promise he made to Jacob, it echoes through time.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, even read it in the Psalms. How long, oh Lord?
Yeah,
You know.
yeah. But I agree with you. I bet you this was a cry of dereliction.
Mhm.
On the cross, Jesus cried, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Mhm.
How many during the next 450 years will say, you said you'd make us a great nation. You told us not to be afraid to come here.
Mhm.
You said you would go with us and that you would bring us out. How long?
Yeah.
How long?
Well, Jacob would have told 450 years, but
I know I'm sure they were hoping that that little detail was wrong.
yeah, right. Use
That's a
use the
long,
metric
long.
system or something, man. Make that go a lot faster. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe we can figure out that 400 was symbolic. I'm sure there were a lot of generations hoping that was a symbolic number and not literal.
Right, right. Make it
But
four
they carried with them the number because it's come to us.
make it 450 days instead.
Yeah, exactly. You sure he meant years? For the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years. 1,000 years are like a day. Maybe he meant months.
Yeah. We sure know it wouldn't be 4,000 years because it was that. Ooh, it's a long time.
Well, thankfully it wasn't. Thankfully it wasn't. So Jacob goes down, he brings everybody. And if you ever want to know who's in the household of Jacob at this point, the Bible lists out everybody. And we didn't skip reading it, right, Minister Joe, because they're not important people. If God remembers their names, then they are names to be remembered. but
Yeah.
it's a lot. So we invite you to read these. But suffice it to say, all of Jacob's children at this point were parents.
I want to say, I wanted us to just say a few things about between 5 and 7, those verses. The idea that they brought all the good things and that they had acquired from the land of Canaan and everything that they had that Pharaoh had given them. I thought for a moment that maybe they're not following the directions of Pharaoh when he said, "Leave everything behind, just come."
The way I would translate this into contemporary languages, they sold the house, they sold everything they owned. They're preparing never to come back. And that might have been what Pharaoh meant when he said leave everything behind. He might not have meant literally leave everything behind, but don't plan to return.
Gotcha.
And they don't. Now, they leave everything behind, and some of these cities belong to them. Beersheba belongs to them, right? It was a covenant with Isaac.
Mm-hmm.
Bethel belongs to Jacob, along with some other places. They established them. They dug wells. They established those habitations. So if the nations of Canaan were living in submission to God, during the 450 years Israel was gone, what should have been done?
We should have followed God.
They should have left all those cities unclaimed, right?
Yeah.
That was claimed property. We even have in Genesis that there were contracts signed between Abraham and the inhabitants of the land and between Isaac and the inhabitants of the land. That territory belonged to them. It should have remained vacant. But what will we find out happened during the 450 years that they were enslaved?
People
The nations of the land took all of those cities back and claimed them as their own.
Yeah.
We'll find that when Israel comes back and has to conquer that land, that they're actually retaking the property that was theirs. Because while they were gone, a whole lot of people claimed the emptiness for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. What's that? Finders, keepers, losers, weepers.
Right. And it's another way in which the nations of the land rebelled against God by seizing property that was legally the possession of other people.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
So it's just an interesting thing. But yeah, I think Pharaoh saying leave everything behind. I think the sense is don't plan to return, move here permanently.
Yeah.
And they do it.
Yeah. I don't think they don't necessarily teach, or if you hear that a lot when you hear about them going to Egypt. You always get this feeling like they're going, like they think, at least that's the way it's been taught in the past. I've heard in the past where people were like, yeah, they're planning on returning, and it doesn't. Yeah, you've made this pretty open it up some, help people understand that. Hey, yeah, this is a permanent thing. They thought this was going to be the end, or this is what it is.
At least 5 years.
Yeah.
Right. At least that for the rest of the famine. But I think Jacob knows it's a lot longer, which is why God makes the promise that he does. And when God says, I'm going to make a great nation for you there, that they're not coming back in 5 years.
Right. It would almost be like this. It's more like, I don't think they sold the stuff off because they think, like you just said, it was theirs.
Yeah, that's just a euphemism. You sell the house, you're not planning on coming back. They didn't lease it out.
Yeah, I think it's more like those. I've seen pictures or something on the internet where there's houses that have been abandoned. Like you walk in the door and there's tables and you're like, where'd these people go? Did something supernatural happen here? And almost go what they call ghosting. Just kind of gone. What happened here? If these walls
and I get the sense a little, I don't keep wanting to return necessarily to J.R.R. Tolkien's writings, but in the book The Hobbit, when Bilbo goes off on his big adventure and he's gone for all those years trying to help the dwarves reclaim their homes, when he comes back, they're selling all of his goods and his relatives have moved into his house. Right. They take him for dead. That's the sense you have with what happens in Canaan. Like they abandon it. I think you're right. They abandon the houses and the people of the land are like, oh, they're gone. It's ours now.
Yeah. They got some good wells over there. Let's get some of that water,
Yeah. Yeah. So everybody kind of comes in and takes over their property. And when they finally do return, all of their possessions have been claimed by others.
Right. And then, even though they're in that point in time when they were leaving, it was a famine. So it might have been some disarray, but when you're walking away and you can expand your borders, you know.
Why
But
not?
the importance of them naming all the offspring and even the dead ones of Judah, and then the offspring of, there's a lot of detail here that if somebody were to really make a nice chart, it would be a lot easier to follow.
Yeah.
But I did read that somebody said that there are some discrepancies or inaccuracies in in this genealogy
Yeah,
that.
I think that's true that it's not going to agree 100% with some of the other genealogies later.
Mhm.
And it could be a matter of just different names. It could be a matter of translation, because remember, we kind of think of Hebrew as one language, but languages change over time. If you think about the way English has changed just in the last 500 years from King James English to today, or if you go back a little bit further, like there's a version of English that's contemporary with like Geoffrey Chaucer, but it's from a different region than London. We can't even read it today. The average person can't even read it. And that's just a few hundred years. Hebrew spans
Mhm.
1,500 years or more of
Mhm.
history. So you can imagine how much that language changed.
Mhm.
So when names are changed, remember that language is evolving over time. The alphabet is changing over time. The Hebrew we have today, like it dates to really near the time of Jesus. So anyway, discrepancies could be a matter of differing traditions. It could be differing opinions. It also could just be the nature that the language changed over time and the names get updated and the manuscripts don't. And could be a lot of reasons why you have discrepancies, but there are some.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting thing is that, again, there's the, even if they're in parentheses, I'm not sure how that looks in the original text, but there seems to be a continual attention to try to keep the names in the tradition of the mother, Rachel and Leah, and
Keeps them separate. Yep.
yeah, and even as much to say as like they're like this in verse 22, it says, "These are the children of Rachel who were born to Jacob, 14 persons in all." When we know that she only had two boys, but these are the total offspring.
Right.
I mean, unless Benjamin married another Rachel.
Yeah. Yeah. The way this is told, it keeps everything very distinct, very faithful to the way it's been described. And I don't know why keeping those divisions is so important, especially since a lot of them don't become important.
Mhm.
The difference between the wives and the concubines is not something that becomes highly significant in the history of Israel. Like you don't get a sense that somehow like Levi or Simeon or Manasseh are more important than Naphtali or Asher or Gad. But the distinctions are here. So I maybe it's for historical accuracy or maybe another reason that we don't quite understand, but you're right.
Well, I think this the simple fact of trying to keep it to the idea of the importance of the mother. I would assume, maybe, I don't know, that's pretty vital. I mean, there's a lot of
Well, it's
folks.
been very important to this story of Jacob's life. So I
Mhm.
think in some ways it validates these women who we've said have been treated as second class citizens by their father first and then by Jacob. And I think it's quite an honor for the Lord to have preserved their name and their lineage and to keep them in the memory of Israel. Some women don't get that blessing. Like we don't know Samson's mother's name. She's just called the woman.
Mhm.
Thank the Lord that when it came to Jacob's wives, God preserved their names, as he did with Ishmael's mother, with Hagar. Even though her name means the foreigner, that might not be her actual given name. I
Yeah.
don't know. But at least she is given a name. I think that's important. And I think it's in some ways a way to honor Leah and Rachel's suffering
Mhm.
by preserving their name and their lineage independent of Jacob.
Mhm.
They're all Jacob's children, but let's remember who's our Leah's and who's our Rachel's. I think that's an honor.
Mhm. So getting back to the number 70 or 72, Is that more along the lines of the attempt to draw the comparison of what the great nation becomes? Or do you think it's more the idea of it's just a perfect number and this is the way it adds up?
Think all we could do is speculate, but I do find it interesting that the number of the sons of Jacob, of children, of descendants of Jacob coming in is the same as the number of the nations in the Tower of Babel.
70.
Those genealogies, yeah, 70 nations. So I think there is some connection there.
Interesting.
I think we can only speculate as to exactly, and you could read lots of commentators and others who have made a lot of that connection and have tried to tease it out as to why. But that's at least the only correlation I see that seems significant to me, is he has as many sons as there are nations.
So I wonder how they keep track of the genealogies beyond that, because like the Exodus, aren't there estimates of like 600,000 to 2 million that actually are part of the Exodus? Do you grab a number there, you guess, or?
Yeah, the Hebrew numbers are interesting. When I used to teach Hebrew, I would say to people that in Rome or in Greece, numbers are very, very specific. In English, we have a whole separate numerical system that's separate from our alphabet. In Hebrew, that's not really the case. The letters double as numbers, and some of the numbers have interesting translations. Like a number that's usually translated 10,000 is the Hebrew word revavah, which is from the word rav, which is what Jacob said when he heard about Joseph: full, many, much. And so I said, literally, revavah means a lot, a lot. And we give it the number 10,000, thinking it's a military unit based on how it was later translated into Greek. We're sort of allowing the Greek translation to direct our understanding of the Hebrew to an extent. And so we're giving it a very specific number. If we're right about that, then you can give a very specific number for the number of Israelites who come out in the Exodus. But my sense is that the Hebrew numbers may not have been quite so exact. They may be more like groupings. So I don't know if that's right. I'm not sure you can give a specific number. You may be able to give a specific number of groupings, but not knowing how large each grouping is, you may not have a good number. So it depends on how you interpret Hebrew numbers, whether you can get specific. But if we allow the Greek translation of the Old Testament to guide our understanding of what the Hebrew numbers mean, then you're going to get a number, and you can find them in commentaries for how many people come out of Egypt. Some people even questioned whether this was arranged as 70 to correlate with the number of the nations. Because in the Greek translation, if I'm remembering correctly, the nations are 72 and so are his sons. So there's obviously the prophetic tradition of Israel saw the correlation of the nations and the sons of Israel.
Yeah.
Yeah, we should probably, we'll pick up a little bit next time with verse 28, but I think we've exhausted our voices and our imaginations. Or do you have more to go?
No, I think we're at this is a good breaking point, because and when we start talking about them settling in and the interaction, I think that'd be good for next session. So let me ask you this question, because you usually ask me first, so I'll just kind of try and shoot it out at you. I mean, what would you say to people when they say that, hey, I don't really have much of a choice in this matter. It seems like God had his plan already, and this is what was going to happen. And what should we do in the face of these kinds of things? Where we thought things were going to go a different way, and boom, it's turning out different.
Yeah, my response, and probably the takeaway for me when I read stories like this, is that all roads lead to the fixed points of history that God has established. But it's still important which road we choose. Because God evaluates us by the road we choose to walk to his predetermined end. He has predetermined the end, and we have no control over that, but we are given a choice on which road to walk to that end. Joseph's brothers walked the road of selling him into slavery. There were other roads. They chose that. They'll be judged by the road they chose. So in our own lives, there are fixed points. We don't always know what they are. Jacob had a better sense of some of the fixed points because God had spoken very specifically to Abraham and to Isaac and to him. And so he maybe had a better sense of some of the fixed points, but we know some of them. We know we're going to die, right? That's a fixed point in our lives. And if we have faith in God, we know we'll be raised from the dead. That's a fixed point in our lives we can do nothing about. And so we might say all the roads of our lives lead to our deaths. We could say that, right? But which road to your death are you going to walk? See, that's you have a choice in that. And we might say maybe some roads are longer than others. I don't know. But they all end in the same place, however long they are. But it still matters which road we walk. And so the idea that God is in control and that history goes where God wants it to go, it's not an excuse for us to take no responsibility or to think that every decision we make is fated. God may present us with 10 roads, and even if they all end in the same place, they're not all equal. They're not all equally moral. They're not all equally good. And they won't all be evaluated as equal before God. So we shouldn't let the fact that we can't control the destination discourage us from the importance of the choice we're making. Because the road we walk to the predetermined future of God is the criteria by which we will be judged. Not where our road goes, but which one we choose to walk. And so that, I would say, Israel was always going to end up in Egypt. And they were going to end up slaves because God told Abraham well in advance that that was the predetermined future. But that doesn't in any way diminish the choices made on the way there. All roads led to Egypt, but we only know the one road they took. But that's not to say there were no others. And so when we evaluate the choices of our lives, it's not by the ultimate destination, it's by the road we chose to take.
So essentially, if you compare Jacob and Joseph, Jacob seems to know what's been passed on to him. Is it safe to assume that Joseph knows that and he's able to rise above it by saying, are they similar or are they both doing the same thing?
Well, Joseph may have known it. We don't know if he knew what Jacob knew. He was definitely Jacob's chosen heir. Jacob had given him that ornamented coat as a sign to his brothers that he was the heir. I think that's clear enough. When he did that, did he also tell him the story? Did he pass down the promises? Did he pass down? I don't know. That might have been something he was going to reserve for their final conversation when he officially gave him the birthright and the blessing. So Joseph may not have known. Joseph may be doing all of this thinking he's saving his family and be completely unaware that he is saving them, but he is also enslaving. He may not know that. He may not know it until 50, when Jacob finally gives him the birthright and blessing and passes down the family story. But it's also possible they were all raised with this story and that he told them this tale the way we do our children in pieces throughout their entire lives. If that's the case, then they all know.
Yeah, right.
How serious this move is. But the way Joseph behaves and the way his brothers behave, I have a sense they don't know yet. I think they'll find out, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. For a few moments while we were talking earlier, I thought for a moment about Jacob and what he was experiencing, and I wondered for a moment whether or not Esau could have withstand what Jacob has gone through, whether he had the fortitude to experience that, and then thinking all of a sudden too, you don't hear much about Esau. You hear about him later, right? You hear he's the Edomites and that sort of stuff. But whether or not Esau and his family could have withstood this type of endurance.
Yeah, if God had chosen Esau instead of Jacob, which he easily could have done, right? The Apostle Paul in Romans said he didn't make the choice because of any character traits either of them had. or because of anything they had done right or wrong. He simply made a choice. So if he had chosen Esau, I imagine it would have been a very different story, but it would have ended up in Egypt.
Mhm.
We often like to think that God chooses us because he needs us, because there's something unique about us, and we're the only way the story will go forward.
Mhm.
But I don't think that's the story of the scriptures at all. I don't
Mhm.
think he needs any of us. It's only by his grace he uses us, and I think he can use anyone.
Mhm.
I don't think he needs a particular quality. So it would have been a very different story with Esau, but they still would have ended up in Egypt. All roads lead here.
They just probably just don't talk about it, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
we don't know that story because that's a dead branch of the tree. It was never materialized, but it could have been. Again, God has fixed points in history that humans will never avoid.
Mhm.
But he's also allowed for free will and offered us many roads to that end.
Mhm.
Esau was never offered. God chose Jacob before they were born. So the story of Esau as the chosen one was never part of God's story.
Yeah.
But he didn't choose Jacob because he couldn't use Esau.
Mhm.
I mean, there was nothing better about Jacob or worse about him, or better about Esau or worse about him. It's God's choice.
Mhm.
But it would have been interesting if he had chosen Esau, given who we find Esau to be. It certainly would have been a very different story.
Yeah, right. Especially had 400 men going with him when he
Yeah,
met.
and he doesn't have the tenacity of Jacob or the doggedness of Jacob, nor the humility of Jacob. He seems a much stronger character. What a different confrontation it would have been, I would imagine, with Laban if he had cheated Esau the way he cheated Jacob. I think we would have had a very different story.
Yeah, yeah,
They still would have ended up in Egypt because that's what God said to Abraham.
that's true.
Right?
Yeah, so it's this is good because I think it helps us to realize that Jacob was processing the information and processing this whole situation. And I think it's important that he does go to God before he goes there. And I know from personally that divine affirmation or that knowledge of knowing that God is with you can help you just about do anything.
And I love what you pointed out, and we talked a lot about that. I'm sure that this promise to Jacob was generationally remembered.
Mm-hmm.
And I imagine that they might have been singing it when Moses led them out of Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I would have liked to have heard that.
Yeah. And for all those who are begging God for mercy, who are hungering and thirsting, like Jesus said, for righteousness, which is the word for justice, for fairness, who've been crushed by this world and have been treated as they did not deserve,
Mm-hmm.
accused of things they didn't do, held down, held back, persecuted, tortured, murdered for things that they had no control over, who have cried out through history. How long?
Mm-hmm.
They hunger and thirst for righteousness. They hunger and thirst for justice. Jesus says they will be filled.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it's a long time in coming, and for Jacob's children, it'll be over 400 years,
Right,
deliverance will come.
right. When he says that word, "I'll be with you," I know it's probably not Emmanuel, but that's what comes to my mind.
It's Anochi Ered Imcha, which is I will go down with you and I will bring you up. So yeah, it's not exactly Emmanuel, which is a little different, but it's the same sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
I will go down with you and I will bring you up. In fact, you might say that that promise of God is most fulfilled in Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
because it's in Jesus he goes down to the pit, right? Remember how many times Joseph called Egypt the pit?
Mm-hmm.
Right? They are going to the grave. Now they're going to be saved. I mean, this is the only way to survive the famine, but they're going to what the place Joseph called the cistern,
Yeah.
right? The pit, right? The hole in the ground. And God says, I'll go down there with you and I'll bring you out. And in some ways, you might say that he fulfills that most fully when he becomes flesh, dies for us, and then comes back and rises from the dead, promising to raise us. That might be the most full fulfillment of these words made to Jacob.
Right.
Do you think?
Oh, yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you.
Anochi yored imcha.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go down with you. That's the incarnation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's the longing of all of our hearts, isn't it?
And when death swallows us, as slavery swallowed Israel, he'll raise us to new life.
Powerful stuff.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Minister Joe.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate your time, and it's good. Always good talking with you on this. I hope that others are inspired to really dig in here, and especially that genealogy. That'll give. I'm sure they'll be blessed. Make a chart for us, and help us out with that, and know that you're loved. I mean, there's just specificity in here that really tries to bring out the what God is doing, and the detail is there. And I think God works in the details of our lives as well, and we need to be looking for him there, as well as the mundane, as well as the exciting, ecstatic stuff. So,
And choose the right road
and
trust the destination to God.
Yes.
But choose the right road.
Well,
knowing that even if you try, like Jonah tried not to go to Nineveh, you're going to Nineveh. If God has said that's where you're going, that's where you're going. But the road you take to get there makes all the difference. We can't change God's fixed destinations for our lives, and that should give us some peace, knowing that God writes the end of the story. But we do have a part to play, and we choose the road. The future is like spaghetti strands of roads, all ending in the same spot, but choose the road that follows God. You may not change the ultimate outcome because that's in God's hands, but it make all the difference.
Right.
And there are fixed points in our lives too. Things that God has determined, moments in which he has intended to encounter us, moments in which he's intended to speak to us. Moses, we see in Moses' life those experiences. We see Joseph, we see Jacob. They're true in our lives too. There are fixed points. God will meet us along the way. It's not just our deaths. I didn't want to leave the impression it's just our deaths. There are moments in which we will meet God too, and all roads lead there. But what matters most is the roads we take to get there, because that's within our choices.
Right.
But he won't leave us. He will meet us, just like he met Jacob on the way to Egypt. He will. That's his promise. All who seek him find him.
Jacob was seeking him, though. I think you just said that in your last phrase. He was seeking him. So, and he knew that.
Right. Yeah. He's not going to necessarily meet us if we're not looking for him. And he could meet us and we could walk right by.
Right.
Like Moses could have walked by the bush, but he didn't. He drew near to it.
Yes. And then it began to speak.
Yeah. It didn't speak first. He said, let's go see why this bush is burning but not consumed. Yeah. So you'll have those moments too. And you have to have your eyes open and you have to be seeking God, right? Well, thank you, Minister Joe, and thank you, everybody, for journeying with us. These are heavy conversations, maybe something you had to pause and think about, and they're heavy for us too. But this has been so valuable. I'm so glad we picked this up again.
Me too.
It's been really meaningful time.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Blessings on you guys.
God bless. See you next week.